Welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in to my seminar today. My name is Dr. Amanda Bradbery. I'm an assistant professor of equine science at Montana State University in the Department of Animal and Range Science. Before we get started, I would like to thank American Quarter Horse International for inviting me to participate in this year's virtual summit, and I look forward to seeing some of you during the Q&A session. Today I'll focus my seminar on equine nutrition as well as some best management practices to optimize how our horses can. The first step in developing a nutrition program, however, is to ensure our horses are in good health. We have regular vaccination programs, our horses are dewormed appropriately, and we regularly check their teeth for any signs of limitations as far as consuming whatever feeds we. When we start developing our nutrition program, it's important to first understand the horse's digestive system. The horse is different than most of our other livestock species. They have a large capacity for hindgut fermentation. So their fermentation occurs in the hindgut, in the large intestine, rather than in the foregut as in our ruminant species. Because they have this capacity for hindgut fermentation, they are grazers, and forage is the base of the horse's nutritional program. And in this hindgut is where we see fermentation of structural carbohydrates. Because this hindgut has such a large capacity, however, we do see some limitations in the horse's foregut, particularly with stomach capacity and with limitations in enzymatic digestion in the small intestine. The horse's stomach capacity is only about 0.5% of their body weight, which for a 500 kilogram horse equates to about 2.5 kilograms. So we're limited in how much we can feed a horse at any given time. Also, with a limited foregut enzymatic digestion, we want our soluble carbohydrates, our proteins, and long-chain fatty acids to be digested and absorbed in the foregut. But we have some limitations with this in how much can be digested and absorbed in that location. So we have to develop nutrition programs and management practices that allows the foregut to be able to digest these products in an adequate amount of time to be able to utilize them appropriately so that we conserve hindgut fermentation for structural carbohydrates. So we address these digestive limitations through best management practices, acknowledging that the stomach has a small capacity and recognizing that small frequent meals are best rather than one large meal in the morning or one large meal in the evening. Requires a little bit more labor on our part, but is ultimately going to be beneficial to the horse and how that horse performs for us in whatever we're asking it to do. We also want to make sure that we provide high quality forage. A high quality forage that's harvested a little bit earlier at a lesser stage of maturity than what we use for most of our ruminant species is going to allow for proteins to be digested in the foregut while allowing those structural carbohydrates to be fermented in the horse's hindgut. We should always consider grain to be supplemental, and only when the nutrient requirements for energy and protein exceed what our forage can provide. This does increase the risk of digestive disturbances, so we must be careful and diligent in our feeding program that when we add grain into the diet, we don't increase that horse's risk of developing a digestive disturbance such as colic or laminitis. So what additional challenges do we face? Obviously, we have a lot of size differences in our horses. We have draft horses, we have miniature horses, and we have everything in between. We need to be able to develop a nutrition program that's specific to each one of those horses. What we use the horses for is going to dictate what nutrition program we put together, whether it's a breeding program, performance horses. We use those horses for work on a ranch. All of those things are going to come into play when developing that program. We want to make sure we feed by weight, not by volume. So many people feed by volume. I feed a scoop of this, I feed a scoop of that. But that's going to be different based on what feed that you're actually providing for that horse. So we want to start getting into the habit of feeding horses by weight rather than by volume. And addressing all of these challenges appropriately can ultimately decrease the incidence of some of our digestive related disorders, including colic and laminitis, which is ideal for all of us and can save our pocketbook a little bit. So forage is the foundation of any nutrition program and must be provided at a minimum of 1% of body weight per day. So for a 500 kilogram horse, that would be a minimum of 5 kilograms provided in a day. This alone, however, will not meet nutrient requirements for a horse on a forage-only diet. This is a minimum requirement when we have grain added into the diet. And this can certainly become a challenge when we have elite performance horses or lactating mares where they have a very high energy and protein requirement, but we still have to meet this minimum forage requirement. This forage requirement is considered a minimum because it maintains gastrointestinal health. Without that, we are going to see much more digestive disturbances, When a horse is on a forage-only diet, however, their voluntary consumption is going to be between 2 and 2.5% of their body weight in a given day, which is going to equate to about 10 to 12.5 kilograms per day for a 500 kilogram horse. So what benefits do we get from this forage? We meet nutrient requirements for maintenance. When it's fed, free choice, so they can consume up to 2% body weight per day. But even fed at the minimum rate, we're going to see healthier digestive tracts, and we're going to be able to minimize some of those vices that can be damaging to our property, such as cribbing and things like that. But we have to keep in mind that this forage that we provide must be high in quality, so we can optimize where those nutrients are digested. But how do we determine forage quality? Forage testing is the most ideal way. However, it's not always easily accessible. If it's not accessible, you want to make sure that that forage that you provide to horses is harvested at a lesser stage of maturity than that we typically provide to cattle or sheep. But we want to make sure that that forage is clean with minimal dust and that it's free of mold so we can reduce any concerns of toxicity and we can reduce any respiratory issues during performance. If forage testing is available, you will get a forage analysis similar to what's shown on this slide, which can be a little bit cumbersome and overwhelming, but we can break it down into some simple parameters to look at. So a highly digestible forage is going to have an ADF value, also known as acid detergent fiber, of less than 35%. It's also going to have a crude protein content of greater than 10%. But certainly you can ask for assistance at any time in interpreting those results. So when do we add grain? We're going to add grain to a horse's diet when their nutrient requirements exceed what we can provide with the forage that we have on hand. And that's mostly going to be from energy and protein. But it's safe to say that certain stages of reproduction, as well as growth and performance, are going to require the addition of grain to the horse's diet to meet those energy requirements so that they don't sacrifice their body condition to be able to do whatever it is that we're asking them. So we'll start with reproduction. And the stages of reproduction can be divided into 4 different stages from a nutritional perspective. We have maiden horses, or open mares. Maiden mares being those that have never had a foal before, open mares being those that just are not bred this season. Then we have early gestation, which has both first and second trimester, late gestation, which is broken into third trimester, and then lactation, which can be further divided into early lactation and late lactation. But ultimately, the goal is to optimize foal growth and development while maintaining the health and nutritional status of the mare, so that way she can go on to have another foal in future years. So how do we feed at each stage of reproduction? Well, a maiden or open mare, we can simply feed to meet nutrient requirements. But this is the best opportunity to make changes to a mare's condition, whether that be improving her condition, or it be reducing the incidence of obesity and asking her to drop a little bit of weight. because we want her ideally to be at a body condition score of 6 as she enters into that reproductive season. In first and second trimester, we can again feed mostly to meet maintenance requirements through high quality forage. As we get later into second trimester, we want to start thinking about adding in some grain to that mare's diet because we're getting close to the period of time where we have the highest rate of fetal growth, so the mare's nutrient requirements are going to increase. We want to make sure that the grain is formulated for mares and foals and feed at approximately 0.5 to 1% of the mare's. So this figure is just an example of why our nutrient requirements are what they are during reproduction. So during first and second trimester, the majority of what's happening with that mare is placental development. So the fetus isn't growing rapidly, so the mare's nutrient requirements don't increase substantially while she's developing the placenta. However, as we enter into third trimester and the placenta is fully developed, that's when we see a strong increase in fetal growth and development, where the mare is then going to have to support the development of that fetus, and her nutrient requirements are going to increase fairly substantially. Once she has her foal and we enter into a period of lactation, this is when a mare's nutrient requirements are the highest. But luckily for us, once she has had that foal, the capacity for intake increases slightly. It's almost like the GI tract stretches out because it has much more room now that there's not a developing foal in a mare's uterus. So we want to make sure, again, that we have high quality forage as the base of the diet. But the mare's grain intake is going to be upwards of 1 to 1.5% of her body weight per day. And we want to ensure that this is formulated for lactation. But the most important thing, and something we never want to forget about, but especially for lactating mares, is water. She cannot produce milk without the water to be able to do that. So we want to make sure she has free choice access to water that's easily accessible and not going to freeze. In late lactation, a mare's milk production starts to decrease, but the nutrient requirements of that growing foal is increasing still. So this is when we want to start thinking about providing some creep feed to the foal through a mare and foal feed. So this figure is a representation of lactation and average milk production. So mare's milk peaks at approximately 2 to 3 months after foaling and then begins to decrease. So somewhere around that 2 to 3 month mark, prior to her decrease in lactation, we want to start providing creep feed to that foal because their nutrient up. So with our growing foal, pre-weaning, again, creep feed is going to be important. During their weanling stage, this is their most efficient stage of growth. Yearlings, how we feed them is going to depend on how we use them. Are we putting them through a sales preparation program? Are we going to ask them to train early? Or are we going to turn them out to pasture and let them grow and develop slowly on their own and bring them up a little bit later to begin those more heavily nutrition-oriented programs? Once they're a 2-year-old, their growth rate begins to slow, and this is typically when most programs start with their exercise, and we'll talk about exercise a little bit more. Ultimately, we want horses to grow at a consistent rate. Now, that could be at a moderate rate of growth, or it could be at a rapid rate of growth. We're going to choose a rapid rate of growth if we need to ask that horse to start an exercise early, or we're putting that horse through a sales preparation program where we want that horse to appear more mature at the time that they go to sale than a horse that may be on a moderate plane of growth. Neither one of these planes are unsafe. However, we do have to be more careful with the rapid plane of growth, that we maintain a consistent plane of growth so that we can reduce the risk of some challenge. Because ultimately we want to optimize musculoskeletal development, and we want to reduce the risk of some common developmental orthopedic disorders. Now, we can't completely wipe that out through nutrition and plane of growth, because there is a factor of genetics in with those developmental orthopedic diseases. But we can certainly reduce the severity of those through our best management nutrition practices. Again, creep feed we want to introduce prior to the mare's reduction in milk production, so that way we can meet the nutrient requirements of the foal as it begins to grow fairly rapidly. It's important to understand that pre-weaning forage utilization is low because the hindgut of that foal is fairly underdeveloped. The hindgut doesn't need to be mature once that foal is born. It needs to mature a little bit later because the foal's primary source of nutrients is milk pre-weaning. So that hindgut slowly develops after that foal is born. So we need to recognize that forage utilization is low in foals and that hindgut doesn't really develop until closer to weaning time. Yearlings, we're going to meet most of their requirements with high quality forage. Now, with that said, if we are putting that horse through a sales prep or exercise program, then their nutrient requirements are greater and we need to add some concentrate to the diet, both for energy as well as protein, but also importantly, calcium and phosphorus, because their bones are growing and developing as well, and we want to provide the nutrients for it to be able to optimally do so. And these horses can be on up to a 60 to 40 ratio of concentrate to forage. Now, exercise. It's important to feed a horse appropriately to meet their nutrient requirements while they're growing to ensure that they grow at a steady rate of pace. But what about exercise? When we add exercise into the mix, nutrient requirements also increase. So now we're feeding that foal or yearling to meet their maintenance requirements, to meet their growth requirements, but also to meet the requirements that are coming from performance. So is exercising horses at a young age beneficial? It can be, yes, because ultimately the goal is to adapt that horse to the loads that it's going to sustain during its performance career. Now, this doesn't have to be an intense exercise program. They don't need to be cutting cows or working hard on the ranch when they're a yearling, but we can certainly start introducing them to certain loads at a low or moderate intensity. If you have a turnout management program, the voluntary exercise and short sprints and playing that these yearlings and foals do is probably sufficient to allow that bone to adapt to those loads. However, if we have more of a confinement management program, which is becoming increasingly more common, we may require some additional forced exercise for those growing horses to allow their bones and joints and muscles to appropriately develop so that once we do increase the exercise demands on the horses, they're able to sustain those demands and appropriately adapt to them. But again, this is going to be low to moderate intensity, pretty slow work, easy going, just putting loads on those bones and joints and allowing the muscles to develop to sustain that. Now, once our horse is grown and they're performance horses and in the performance horse industry, their energy requirements increase relative to the performance demands. So if we're demanding more of them, their nutrient requirements are going to be greater than a horse that we just take out every now and then and go for a trail ride on. So where do we get the energy from? We get the energy from carbohydrates, which can be divided into fibers and starches, as well as fat. And it's important to understand that not all activities require the same source of energy. It's become incredibly popular over the last few years to feed low starch diets to horses because starch is a bad thing. Starch does terrible things to the horse. Well, that's not always true. When we ask our horses to perform certain events that require anaerobic exercise or peak intensity, we need starch in that horse's diet because glucose is the sole form of energy that can be used during those periods of extreme intense and anaerobic exercise, such as cutting or quick bursts of speed, or in our race horses. That starch is incredibly important. For our horses that do more aerobic exercise, more endurance type events, lower intensity, but more endurance in nature, fat is the preferred source of energy. So it's important to keep that in mind. Starch is not always a bad thing, and low starch diets have their place, but diets with starch in them also have their place. So it's very important to keep that in mind. The challenges that present themselves when feeding a performance horse is feeding management. We have to be able to meet the minimum forage requirement for these horses, but also meet their energy requirement by adding grain in there. And for some of our elite athletes, this can become a little bit of a challenge. We also have to be able to estimate the horse's workload. And there's no black or white, this horse does this every day of the week, so this is his nutrient requirement. There are some fluctuations in it and some gray area there, so we have to be able to estimate what a horse is doing. And we have to recognize that the horse is not going to consume more just because they're working harder. So that makes us have to adjust the ratios of concentrate to forage, and we need to be able to put more calories into smaller meals. We need to make that meal a little bit more dense in energy rather than just having to feed more grain. We're going to have to reduce the horse's forage intake a little bit to make room to put the grain into the diet, but making sure to always meet that minimum requirement of 1% body weight per day of forage. It's also important to recognize that through sweating, horses are going to lose electrolytes. So they may need some of those added back into the diet. And we also sometimes see B vitamin deficiencies in our elite performance horses. But commercial rations for performance horses always do a great job of adding B vitamins in there. B vitamins are produced by the hindgut. But during performance events, the hindgut can't keep up with the demands for B vitamins. So we need to make sure we add those in there. And commercial rations for performance horses usually do a great job of adding these in there. But certainly you can add electrolytes and B vitamins as well without much risk of. So this table just represents recommended intakes for horses in different stages of life. So a horse that's mature and at maintenance requirements can sustain itself predominantly on forage alone. But as we start increasing our demands from them, whether that be through breeding of pregnancy and lactation, or growth and performance, or a combination of growth and performance, then we need to start adding a little bit more grain into the diet, which is going to sacrifice some capacity for forage, but we're always making sure that we meet that minimum forage requirement. So we'll shift gears a little bit from requirements to how we actually feed these horses and practices. And in order to do that, we first need to be able to evaluate our nutrition program. And we do that through determining their body condition. And we can do this through body weight, which is useful for both feeding programs as well as administering medications. And it can be determined directly or estimated. Not everybody has a scale to walk a horse over. So there are a couple of different ways that we can estimate a horse's body weight, either through a weight tape or through an equation, which I will show you in the next slide, to be able to calculate your horse's body weight and appropriately use that for your nutrition program. We also use body condition score, which is an assessment for the degree of fat cover that a horse has, so we can determine where they lie in that nutritional status and what we need to do, whether they need to gain some condition, lose some condition, or simply at. So this is the equation for estimating body weight. Essentially, it assumes that the horse is a cylinder. So we take the length and then we take circumference around the horse's heart girth and fit that into this equation and be able to calculate body weight in kilograms and move forward from there on how much to feed that horse or what direction you want to take your program. Body condition scoring is a subjective and indirect determination of energy reserves. It's based on the visual as well as tactile appraisal of 6 body areas. And I want to emphasize the tactile appraisal here, where you want to put your hands on this horse and feel how much fat is in each of these locations, along the neck, behind the shoulder, along their withers, down their back, their ribs, hooks, tail head, and pins, and be able to assign a score to each of those locations from 1 to 9, with 1 being very skinny, emaciated, and 9 being morbidly obese. Where we want our horses to fall predominantly is a 5 or a 6, with 5 being ideal for our performance horses and 6 being ideal for our breeding mares. We want our mares to have a little bit of extra condition on them, so they have some more energy reserves for that foal in case that may become necessary. With this said, it's important to understand that it takes 60 days or better to increase a horse's score by 1, and that's about 40 to 50 kilograms. And you can readily observe about a 0.5 score change, but it's going to take about 60 days to get a horse up a body condition score. So if we have a mare at a body condition score of 4 that we want to breed, we need to start feeding her 120 days prior to when we want to breed her to be able to get her to that body condition score of 6 before we put her into a breeding program. So here are some examples of body condition scores, with 1, as we said, being emaciated. Hopefully we don't see many of these horses. And then bottom right corner at a body condition score of 8. This horse is morbidly obese with a lot of fat pockets in the same areas that we appraise both visually and tactile. So puts this horse at greater risk of metabolic diseases such as insulin resistance or equine metabolic syndrome or laminitis. So we certainly don't want to be anywhere close to an 8 or a 9 with our horses. The top right represents a body condition score of 5, which we said is ideal for our performance horses. And bottom left, more of a body condition score of 6, where we want our breeding mares to be. A really nice cutoff when assessing body condition score is being able to see the ribs. If you can see the horse's ribs, they're less than a 5. If you cannot see the horse's ribs, they're a 5 or above. So it's kind of a nice visual cutoff of where these horses may stand nutritionally. So our goals for developing a feeding management program are to meet nutrient requirements, to optimize growth and development, to meet our horse's performance potential, and then to reduce the risk of negative effects such as colic, laminitis, developmental orthopedic diseases, or other performance-related disorders such as tying up and fatigue. If our horse's diet meets their nutrient requirements, then our feeding management is going to be what reduces the risk of a lot of these negative effects. And how do we do that? Predominantly through consistency, reducing the stress of change and being consistent across the board in how we manage our horses and how we feed them. This can become particularly challenging when we have inexperienced employees with limited time, a lot of different employees that do things different ways. So training comes into play here to make sure that all of the employees that you have working for you do everything in a very similar manner, so that way we can reduce the stress on horses and maintain that level of consistency and hopefully reduce the risk of some of these negative effects that are common. So first things first, when we feed grain, we want to reduce meal size and increase the frequency. So no more than 0.5% of body weight in grain per meal. And again, for a 500 kilogram horse, this equates to about 2.5 kilograms in a meal. We want equal intervals between feeding times. So if we have to feed our horse 5 kilograms per day, then I can break that into 2.5 kilogram meals, but I want them to be evenly spread out during the day, 6 a.m., 6 p.m., or as close to that as we can get. So it's incredibly important as we start adding more meals into that horse's nutritional program that we keep those as spread out and as equal as we can. And again, we already mentioned this, but we want to make sure we feed by weight, not by volume. And I love this picture as an example of all the different sizes of scoops. So when somebody comes to me and says, I feed a scoop of Nutrina Safe Choice, okay, well, what's your scoop? Because that doesn't really tell me a whole lot. But if you tell me I feed 2 kilograms of Nutrina Safe Choice every day to my horse, then that's something that I can work with. When we do feed our horses and provide that meal to them, we want to avoid feeding our horses directly on the ground. That way we can reduce sand intake, reduce the risk of sand colic and things of that nature. We want to be able to use hay feeders and feed them at eye level or below. The only exception for this is going to be a hay net. We don't really want them to be below eye level and then run the risk of a horse becoming tangled in it. But most of our other feeders we want to have at eye level or below. Round bale feeders are incredible to discourage waste, and I have a table coming up in the next slide that shows the amount of waste and how we can reduce the amount of waste by using different types of round bale feeders rather than just placing a round bale out on the ground. Troughs that we feed in, as well as provide water in, we want to make sure that they're clean and free of mold, and that the horses have free access and plenty of water throughout the day. If we have a group house setting, that makes things a little bit more challenging, but certainly manageable. And the way we manage that best is by housing horses according to nutrient needs, whether that be their nutrient requirements, or if we have a pasture full of our fat horses or a pasture full of our skinny horses, so that we can manage all of those horses similarly, will work to our benefit. So housing based on nutrient requirements, body condition, or temperament will make things a lot easier in developing your feeding management program. You want to make sure, though, when you do provide grain to these horses in a group setting, that you make sure there's adequate space when you feed the grain. Whether that be a long trough where we would want about 10 feet or so between each location that you feed a horse, or you have individual feeders. If you have individual feeders, you want to make sure there's at least one bucket per horse or one feed pan per horse, and that they're spread about 8 meters apart. Feed the most aggressive horse first. I know most people don't like this from a behavioral perspective, that horse needs to learn to be patient, but ultimately then that it's a safety concern. It's easier to just feed that horse first, get it out of the way, and then you can start feeding some of the more submissive horses, and then no one gets hurt. No other horses in that pasture gets hurt because of you trying to delay feeding the aggressive horse. And then make sure they always have access to forage. Obviously, being the base of the food pyramid for horses, we want to make sure that they have plenty of access. So this table is an example of the amount of hay wasted and what it takes to pay back that hay feeder through the conservation of hay and the utilization of more of it. So a hay ring is one of the more common hay bale feeders. Only about 19% of that bale is wasted compared to no feeder at all, which is about 57% of the bale wasted. Horses like to make beds out of their hay. They like to stomp it around, and so whatever of that we can conserve is certainly going to be beneficial, and we can pay that hay ring back in about 2 months with what we save in hay. A cinch net is simply a net that wraps around the bale, and we only lose about 6% in that and can pay that hay net back in less than a month, which is great. Hay huts are phenomenal. There's only about 9% of the bale wasted with these. They're a little bit more expensive, so it's going to take about 4 months to be able to pay that back, but definitely worth the investment. And then a covered cradle. This you lose about 11% of the bale. They're more expensive though, so it's gonna take you about 20 months to be able to pay that back. But all of these things are important to consider and definitely beneficial from a hay conservation perspective. But what if we have horses on pasture? If we manage our horses on pasture and don't provide that dried forage product as grass hay or something, then we need to make sure we're aware of the stocking rate. And that's going to vary by whatever region you're in. And that dictates how many animals you can have on that pasture at any given time to not waste the pasture. You want to make sure that you mow, fertilize, and rotate appropriately, and this all plays into weed control so that you can optimize the actual grass in your pasture for horses to be able to consume. Small land spaces are becoming increasingly more common, and so we have to be able to manage those pastures with a small amount of land. And we do that through developing sacrifice areas, dry lot pens, or something like that we can put the horses in during bad weather or when the pasture just needs a break, and feed a hay product during that amount of time until the pasture is ready for horses to go back into. We can also use pasture rotation. So if you have your horses in one pasture, you're letting another pasture rest at the same time that they're in that pasture, and then you rotate those horses once the next pasture is ready for grazing. Those horses move in there, and the pasture that they just came off on is given time to rest. But it's important to make sure that we adapt horses slowly to pasture. And there are certainly horses that are problem horses, and we need to control their intake of pasture. And that could be associated with time of year when the spring grass comes up and it's very lush and rich. So we want to be able to control intake for those horses. And the best ways to do that are either to use those sacrifice areas and confine those horses, or put on a grazing muzzle, which all horses hate, but ultimately good for them in the long run and limits the rate of consumption and how much that those horses can consume. And also the time of day that we allow horses to graze. Sugars are highest in the morning and lower in the afternoons. So if we have a horse that we need to control their sugar intake while they're on pasture, it's best to turn them out in the afternoons rather than first thing in the morning. When we do have to change a horse's diet, we want to make sure that we do it slowly, because again, consistency is key, and reducing the amount of stress is ideal in reducing the potential negative effects of changing that nutrition program. And we do that through adding and replacing about 25% of the horse's diet every 2 to 3 days. So it should take about 8 to 10 days or better to actually change that horse from one feed to another feed. So to break it down as an example, you've got a new feed that came in. You want to make sure you still have some left of your old feed so that there's some overlap and we can change slowly the horse onto the new diet, where on days 1 and 2, 75% of that horse's meal is their old feed and only 25% is their new feed. Then on days 3 and 4, we want to do 50% of old feed, 50% of new feed. Then days 5 and 6, we do 25% of old feed, 75% of new feed. And then finally on day 7 is that horse is going to be fully moved over onto their new diet. So this can certainly be slowed down. That's about as quick as I would go, is the 7-day mark. But recognize that even though you can have that horse changed over to its new diet in 7 to 10 days, it's still going to take about 3 weeks for that horse to metabolically adapt to that new diet. So don't expect to see miraculous things happen in 7 days. Give that feed some time to actually work for you. So in all, from getting that new feed into the door to seeing beneficial effects could be about 28 days or 4 weeks before you get maximum benefit. And then it's going to take about 5 weeks for the horse to withdraw from its previous feed. So it could take even up to 5 weeks for you to see the greatest outcome from a change in your nutrition program. And this is incredibly important to keep in mind when you have performance events upcoming, that you make these changes slowly, but you will also allow the time for that to work. So if you're showing your horse in June or December, you probably want to start about a month or a month and a half before you start showing that horse, so that way they're fully adapted to that diet before this happens. And when you do make changes, make sure you monitor carefully for signs of digestive disturbances. Signs of colic being rolling, biting at their side, general discomfort. Signs of laminitis, rocking back and taking weight off of their front toes. All of these things can be signs of digestive disturbance, as well as diarrhea and things like that. We just want to keep a close eye out and make sure we don't have any negative effects from that change and address those appropriately. So to summarize, again, consistency is key. Regular health care, vaccinations up to date, deworming when possible, making sure the horse's teeth are healthy so that they're able to consume what we're providing them. High quality forage is the base of any diet. Again, recognizing that they will consume anywhere from 2 to 2.5% of their body weight in any given day, but the minimum requirement for long stem forage is 1% of body weight per day. Plenty of water, consistent feed management, feeding at the same time every day, not changing the amount frequently, and when you do have to change the amount or type of feed, we're doing that slowly. When we have growing performance horses, we want to maintain a steady plane of growth. That way we can minimize digestive disturbances, minimize some of those developmental orthopedic disorders, and have that horse ready to perform for us when we're ready for them to do so. And then consistent exercise programs to allow those young horses to begin to adapt to the load that they're going to have to carry, which will make their skeletal system, their joints, their muscles much stronger once we do start asking them to perform for us. And so with that, I thank you all for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you during the Q&A sessions. And again, thank you to American Quarter Horse International for allowing me to participate in this year's virtual summit. Thank you all.